about the reasons why we should legalize cannabis and the benefits it would have to society. But again, with legalizing cannabis for the person who's in his 50s, 60s who saw a lot of propaganda against cannabis would be like, you're crazy, you're gonna cause more crime.
I've been hung up on by multiple talkback commentators who've had me on their show. So yes, I have been called crazy and naive and all of those other things.
So again, like why should someone, let's say older, why should they believe in this new change? Like what would benefits would bring to New Zealand if we do?
I think first and foremost, people need to recognise that the debate around cannabis reform isn't a debate about whether cannabis should exist, because cannabis does exist. And I find the greatest irony in the argument of criminal prohibitionists, people who advocate for the status quo, is that they use examples of how badly things are working right now to justify continuing the approach that we have right now. So the classic example is you hear somebody say, well, cannabis has caused so much harm, why would you want to legalize it? And it's like, well, actually, because you're pointing to the failures of your status quo approach. The reason that I want to legalize it is to get control over that supply chain to ensure that people who are using it, who do experience problems, have the opportunity to come forward and to get help if they need it, but also that adults can make informed, evidence-based decisions to reduce harm to themselves, to their whānau, their families, and their communities. So fundamentally, for me, I think that it's about going, okay, cannabis, like alcohol, like tobacco, any given substance can cause harm.
Yeah.
So the next question actually has to be, what kind of legal, social, economic, justice approaches do you want to take to that substance? And right now, the approach that we take, pushing it underground, pretending that it doesn't exist, manifests the most possible harm ever. We have chaos. We have a free-for-all. Anybody who wants cannabis can get it. And you have no control over potency, drug dealers don't check ID, all of this profit is being ploughed into the criminal
But who's to say that would not happen when it's legalized?
Well, effectively you have to recognise that if you look at the history of all different types of approaches to all different substances, so here, I mean, I could start invoking, for example, the approach in 1990 in Switzerland where they legalised heroin. They didn't legalize in the sense that most people think legalization works. People hear the word legalize and they go, oh, there's going to be dairies, there's going to be corner shops, people are going to throw it from the rooftops. That is not what legalization means.
Yeah.
Legalization, by definition, is about putting a legal framework in place to control a substance. Prohibition is about saying that substance is banned and we're going to punish anybody who uses it. Hasn't worked, okay? So to park that situation in Switzerland, which I'm very happy to get to and unpack, because I think it's a very important example of how actually, if we genuinely want to grapple, particularly in New Zealand, with issues pertaining to methamphetamine or P,
big problem,
then we need to start being honest about the fact that our current approaches are demonstrably failing. So if you look at the different spectrum of approaches, right, on the one side of things, you've got effectively complete prohibition. So that's criminal prohibition, where we go, that's banned, it's illegal, anybody who uses it is going to be punished, anybody who supplies it is going to be punished. On the complete other end of the spectrum, the other extreme, you have complete commercialization, a free market, whereby anybody can advertise it, it can be sold to anybody, anywhere, there's no local community input on where shops end up cropping up. Both of those instances where you have black market and therefore criminal control, or free market and therefore corporate multinational control, both of those instances are instances of the most manifestation of harm to a community, because you have entities, whether they are underground criminal organizations or commercial organizations, that are incentivized to exploit vulnerable communities to make a quick buck, whether it is through lacing a substance that you sell to a kid with something stronger on the black market, or whether it is, advertising RTDs, alco pops to children, effectively. Both of those instances, bad. How you get away from those is regulation. Regulation in the middle is control not only of who can access it, so demand, but also access and control, rather, of supply. So this is the big distinction between decriminalisation and legalisation. Decriminalisation is simply about removing criminal penalties from the people who use a substance, but it's completely silent on the issue of supply. Supply and control of that supply means that you have to have licenses, regulation, and effectively control over who is able to sell it, whether it can even be sold, what level of potency is allowed to be produced, and the raft of other kinds of duties of care that you impose on the person who is providing the substance. So in the instance of, for example, one of the most harmful substances known to people, humankind, heroin. So in the 1980s, there was a spate in all across Europe, but Switzerland dealt with it in a really fascinating way, of heroin overdose deaths, of needles strewn in alleys and parks, families torn apart, people's lives ruined, more and more people filling up prison cells, all of these problems. And Ruth Dreyfus, who was the president of Switzerland, very pragmatic people, they decided that instead of going, we're going to try and ban that more than it's currently banned, just actually inspect the madness of that as a proposition. Yeah. Instead of saying that, which is what the typical approach has been under the so-called war on drugs, which, by the way, is entirely baseless rhetoric, but anyway, I'm not going to get into that. It's ludicrous. So they said, we're actually going to control the supply of this substance. Right now, you have a whole bunch of people who are trapped in this cycle of getting high and then effectively chasing that high. And in order to chase that high, they will sell everything that they own. They will commit petty crimes, which potentially escalate the more that they need, the more that they become embroiled in the criminal underground, because they have to keep rubbing shoulders with people who do not fit within the normal kind of parameters of society. When you push something underground, you force people to interact with people who we otherwise know as criminals. And again, there's so much social commentary that we could get into in terms of alternative structures of identity and social organization and otherwise, but we're not doing a psychology class. So effectively, they said, we are going to instead create a legal framework where people who are addicted to this substance will come and have it prescribed to them by medical professionals. So they set up not retail shops, but they set up clinics for prescription to people who had heroin addictions. So if you have a heroin addiction, you could come in, you could be prescribed your heroin, which would be administered to you by a medical health professional. It would be of a certain level of potency. It also would not have any other substances cut into it, which is what happens again in the criminal underground. And also you would be provided with what's called wraparound care. So that wraparound care would be, if you're homeless, we'll get you a house. If you need a job, we will help subsidize an employer to give you a job. You need mental health care, we'll give you mental health care. You need to reconnect with your family, we will help you with that. All of these things effectively came way before we started to understand, as we do in contemporary psychology, the issues of what drives mental health and addiction. The precipitating factors to mental health and addiction, as outlined in this government's mental health and addiction inquiry, Hiara Oranga, is, in a nutshell, you can have a biological predisposition inherited from your parents towards
Wait, are we talking about pea babies or regardless of pea babies?
No, regardless of that. So, I mean, that's potentially one of the things. So is FASD, fetal alcohol syndrome. Yeah. So that's one of the more extreme versions of that. But in terms of mental health, you can have some hereditary genes which can be triggered effectively by your environment. So you can have these underlying things inside of you, and based on your life experiences, your circumstances, the people who come into your life, all manner of different events, those underlying biological predispositions can be triggered, or they can be kind of turned up or down on the dial. And effectively what we find is that the two major driving factors of addiction in particular are isolation and trauma. And right now, our major social, legal, economic justice response to people who are experiencing addiction is to further isolate and traumatize them. And we keep going, well, why does this keep getting worse? Well, maybe it's because we're ignoring the evidence, So effectively what I'm trying to point out there is not, this argument that we should just go, hey, let's free everything up, because that's not what legalization is about. In fact, it is about instituting different frameworks that take into account evidence, that ensure that people who need help can get it, and that we stop wasting all of this resource on these mythologies that we've built on the war on drugs so that we can look like strong men and beat our chests.
Yeah, no, the war on drugs is, as you said, baseless. We're not fighting the root of the problem. We're fighting the symptoms.
Absolutely.
And I think, especially with loneliness and abuse, I think if trauma, if they were to respond to that at a very early age, you could see, dramatic results.
And that's where, I mean, if you were to talk about things like poverty, for example, one of the kind of major conversations that's been occurring, particularly in Aotearoa of late, has been the issue of child poverty. And again, just to unpack that on an economic basis, you speak to people who operate in NGOs and in spaces of actually trying to solve these problems on the coalface, on the front lines. And child poverty is a construct that was effectively a way to try and help people empathise with family poverty. Because we have become so cold-hearted as a broader society by virtue of, I think, deeply individualistic economic reforms that occurred in the 1980s, particularly here, but, they also equated to, in similar time frames, what was happening in the US and the UK. Effectively, you've ended up with a society that sees poor people as to blame for their own poverty, as opposed to recognising that in order to get certain outcomes in life, you need hard work plus circumstance. A whole lot of people do not have that circumstance, which is the critical ingredient to make the hard work mean something.
For sure. There is a luck component of which family you're born in, which environment you're born in, which neighbourhood you're born in.
And that's the point of the social contract. The point of the social contract is to enable people to reinvest in the society that helped them to flourish so that other kids in the future have the same opportunities that they did. But we seem to ignore all of that when we talk about the kind of economy that we're building.
I think there is an extreme lack of awareness of the complexity of these issues. I think most people that I've talked to and people that are against it view it as black and white. Either it's good or bad, legalize or criminalize. But there is these gray areas where it's not talked about, not understood, and I think that is why most people are scared about it, and they don't want it's a sort of it's bringing out the worst. They're thinking the worst in that, legalization.
But also, I think it's probably a fundamental misunderstanding of, it's that misalignment, right? To use kind of business speak between the slogan and the KPIs. The key performance indicator, surely, of drug policy should be how many people are using the substance. How harsh the substance is becoming, how potent it's becoming, how many people are being imprisoned, whether you're getting control of what some people characterize or caricature as the drug problem. The slogan is the war on drugs, but if you actually look at the data, the stats, the evidence, the war on drugs has been the biggest proponent and cause of the explosion of drug problems across the world over the past 40 or 50 years. In fact, if you are to marry those two things up, to marry up the KPIs of we want less people in prison, we want less people addicted to these substances, we want these substances to be less potent, we want less families torn apart, we want this issue to get better, then we need to deal with the slogan and the kinds of things that we are doing. Because, to talk about, for example, the birth of the war on drugs, primarily coming out of the United States.
Was that the Reagan administration?
Yeah. Reagan and Nixon. And, there's a Nixon advisor who went on the record in, I think it was 2012, you'll be able to look it up, who said that, they were very conscious of the reality that, the DEA that they were building, the Drug Enforcement Agency, it wasn't actually about the drugs. It was about particularly targeting and breaking up meetings, vilifying the leaders of, and destroying communities of the civil rights blacks and the anti-war left. That sounds like a conspiracy theory. But it is on the record as the very intention. You can look into the research or you can just decide to engage in an uncritical way with the way that things are presented through, you know, our political leaders or, you know, mainstream media platforms or whatever else. And that's not to say that, you know, I'm going to bag out mainstream media journalists, many of whom are doing incredible jobs, but it is to say that there is a divergence between facts and how those facts are represented.